Good morning.
Good morning, Dimitri, Chetan, Jacob. How are we all doing?
Splendid.
We're doing splendid. It is good to see you. Jacob, good
I'm
to
good.
see
How
you,
are
my
you?
friend. I'm doing well. Jacob, how are you?
What's up, everybody? Good to be here. Ready for some netball?
Yeah, so I am surrounded by every single book by David Hume and all of my Hegel because I have a presentation on Hume and Hegel in common life. And I may not have sanity by this afternoon, so if you never hear from me again, that's why. And I'm just really taken, whenever I do a lot on David Hume. I would say David Hume was a major philosopher for me. Well, he was. He definitely woke me up. And what really does amaze me is going back in the subtlety of detail in these works that if you miss the entire point of the philosophy. Like, for example, in his treatise, the introduction, and then also in the inquiry of concerning human understanding, he makes this point where he says that the science of man has to be the foundation of all thinking. And you hear that and you go, oh, okay, that doesn't mean biology. That doesn't mean physics. By science of man, he means the lived experience of the subject in their world. Well, it's a real problem though when you're a 21st century person and you read the word science and that means some sort of like biology or something, right? And you see, if you miss that really subtle detail, then his whole project just looks like a giant effort of deconstruction and tearing everything down. But what he's trying to do is say, no, science, science as a science, biology can't be the foundation of man. Therefore, he gets rid of the possibility of verification. Then he says, no, theological religious speculation independent of what he calls natural religion. He makes this huge distinction between philosophical religion, basically, and natural religion. And what he means by that is he has nothing wrong with the religion that one lives in their daily life, but he has problems with these religious systems that mean you don't actually have to live like Christ. You just have the right theological belief. So he cuts that down. He cuts down science as replacing the lived experience. He cuts down politics, cuts down all these different things. But if you don't catch this little freaking detail in the introduction where he talks about the science of man, basically meaning lived experience, phenomenology, all these different things, then it just seems like he's going around and for the fun of it, tearing everything down just because he wants to. But really, and this is where I'm trying to connect it with the doctrine of essence, because apparently I'm supposed to present on this and not sound like an idiot, is that what he is getting at is that you have to always do your thinking with the person and subject in mind. And if you do not do that, well, then you end up in a certain tyranny. And then I'll pass to everyone to speak. So this is what I've been thinking about recently. But he says this part, something where he's like, indeed, do philosophy. But as you are a philosopher, do not forget to be a man. By that, he means person. Right. So he's like, as you do philosophy, and critically too, he is not saying that philosophy is bad, because the very realization that philosophy cannot be its own grounding without the involvement of the subject in of itself is a philosophical realization. So right there is a kind of negation sublation. Like, philosophy reaches the point where it realizes it can't be the grounding of its own system by itself autonomously. And that actually leads to what he calls the good philosophy, which is then, funny enough, he talks about dialectic, like a dialectical relation between the subject and world in their common life, which would then make me think of the true infinity that our dear Mr. Dimitri did a lovely video on recently. Very well done, my friend. So again, it's just really funny and how little details, especially in these older books. Same thing happens in Aristotle. Like, you miss what the frick he means by the science of man, then you get an entirely different impression of what David Hume is doing, as opposed to if you catch that. So it kind of horrifies me, though, because then I'm like, I need to reread every old book because there may have been some little detail on page 6 that I missed that transforms the entire meaning of the philosophical system. And in the same way that when I reread a few months ago, or I don't know what year it is anymore, I'm just an adult. The more of an adult you are, the more you don't know what year it is. It's a great thing. Like, catching at the end of book 7 of the Republic, after he talks about Plato's cave, was like, oh, by form, I mean something like the orbit of planets. What? Oh, I missed that. Oh, that changes things. Crap. Like, you just wonder how many old books are like that. Same, of course, happens with the Bible, right? You go and reread the Bible and you're like, oh, I missed that detail. Oh, that changes things. It's interesting how these books can do that. So that's where I've been at today. And it's finally not freezing outside in Virginia. It's actually like summer or something.
Thank you for the really stirring introduction, Daniel. Yeah. really. Just a couple of things coming off the top for me. How to put it? It seems to me that we actually have to reread our lives, like you're rereading those philosophical texts, periodically, again and again, revisiting and like rereading the landscape of our life, just in the course of a day. And that's what I did today. I went for a little walk and had a little conscious cannabis session, and it really helped me to untangle some emotional existential knots that have caused me to reread the book of my life just slightly. So that was really fascinating. And then almost in contrast with that, I'm thinking about this cutting down that you're describing. Like, what if the philosopher is in some ways like an axeman? And this is not a way that I've thought about what a philosopher can be, but that sort of active clearing out the way of things as somehow the work of the philosopher. It's really interesting for me as well.
No, that's a lovely comment. And Mr. Luber, good to see you. It's so interesting because David Hume contrasts what he's doing with, say, the work of common sense found in, say, a Thomas Reid or something, or even maybe a G.E. Moore, where, that's where he's like, look at my hand. And what he's saying is he's like, no, you cannot say we get at like certain concrete epistemological foundations from just common sense experience, right? You must have philosophical reflection. The issue is that philosophical reflection also cannot be its own grounding. And the problem is the philosopher thinks that it can be its own grounding autonomously as opposed to dialectically. And so what ends up happening is that philosophy is a necessary kind of risk that without, you can't be in the business of clearing away, say, what David Hume will call bad philosophy or false philosophy, or you're mentioning like the axeman clearing away the trees. It's almost like in your life, weeds will grow or abstractions will grow that actually get in the way of like, living as a full human being for Mr. Hume, and that you require philosophy to cut those things away and to get rid of those different things. But then the problem, this is what, it's very interesting, the way that my favorite Hume scholar describes this, Dr. Livingston, is he says the very act of having that axe and cutting things down makes you go, man, I'm really powerful. Wow, look how smart I am. I can cut down all these different trees and axes. I'm really capable. Oh man, maybe I should be in a position of power. Oh, maybe I should start telling other people what they should do. Oh, maybe I have an idea of how the world should run. There's Mr. Javier Rivera. Good to see you, sir. And so what ends up happening is that philosophy, precisely in its ability to cut down weeds, to cut down trees, and to create clearing from your story, then makes you feel kind of heroic. He calls it the heroic ascent, where you're like, look what I'm capable of doing with thinking. And as a result, you start to see yourself as qualified to tell other people what they should think. Or you become qualified to believe that you have some sort of mastery over other people. And so then the next move that has to happen for Hume is that philosophy has to cut down itself. Like you get the ability of the axeman, and then you have to also go, no, I have to stop myself from thinking that because I'm capable of philosophical reasoning, that means I should apply that beyond the work of as a subject on myself, right? Because that's kind of the temptation. You start saying, oh, I should create the perfect nation state. I should create the perfect system. And you think you can do that precisely because of the power you feel by cutting down the trees. And if you don't catch that move, and this is what's important, the other thing I'm critical of in Hume's studies is we act as if there's no relation between his work in history, politics, and philosophy, that they're all unrelated. Well, it just happens to be that Hume's philosophy is one that would contain the state and just happen to avoid some of the mistakes that he's gone through and seen the Whigs do in history, right? What a coinky-dink. No, there's a coherent model. But the issue is, if you read Hume as just kind of a simple empiricist, which I'm not saying empiricism is necessarily bad, but most of the time Hume is read as basically a kind of empiricist, well, then you see no connection between any of his works on economics, history, politics, society. All of it just seems like a all-you-can-eat buffet where he has some random things. But if you start to see him in the work of a common life, and a defending of the common life, and learning for us to come to terms with ourselves as subjects who must deal with abstract reasoning, which gives us a feeling that we have power to to conform the world to that abstract reasoning, but then we learn to resist that feeling and to be constantly doing the work of the subject on ourselves so we don't fall into that temptation. That's a very, very different understanding of what David Hume is in the business of. And then, of course, I think we can start overlaying it with Hegel. There is a funny way in which there's a Hegelian Hume 100 years before Hegel, and then, of course, that would lead us into topics like Lacan and different things like that, which I had the lovely opportunity to speak with Mr. Rivera and Daniel Zaruba and Matthew Stanley the other day on all of those different things. So those are some thoughts that come up for me, Jacob, on Azure. So it's fascinating to see Hume in that business.
Oh, thank you for that, Daniel. I'll hand it over to anybody else, but just, really fascinating stuff. And I do have that inheritance of Hume as like this kind of dry, not very interesting at all thinker. And I'm still like contending with my projection of what Hume is, combined with like the reality of you being so effing fascinated with Hume and writing so much about him. So it's like, those are kind of still contending for me.
It's funny you say that, and then I'll give it to Dimitri. That's basically what happened with me with Hegel. Like, because I was a massive Scottish Enlightenment person, massive in Hume, lots in economics and different things. And then I ran into all of these different people, and they were like, Hegel's a big deal. And you're like, what? You're kind of like, what did I miss? And then you're like, well, let me go and look. And then when you reread them through a new lens of understanding him through these different thinkers, for whatever years ago, you're like, oh my gosh, there's something more here. And then you say, oh, Hegel fits. Because I've always done the main work that I was always in, I guess, since whenever I started being crazy, was counter-enlightenment thinkers. My big, someone starting with Vico, Vico, who I think is a super genius, Hume, Hartman, Scottish Enlightenment, and then all these weird thinkers nobody reads, like Michel Tonnier and personal knowledge, Blondel, all of these different, Kowabaska, and then, of course, all the economists. And then to have a realization that, oh my gosh, Hegel fits in that tradition and actually seems to encapsulate the logic of that tradition was mind-blowing. But that also is exciting because that means there's always possibly new work to do, right? There's always new avenues that you don't even realize are there. So the feeling you're describing there made me think of that, Jacob.
I'm going to bring something else into the conversation. I've been reading Hegel, The Science of Logic, a really great book. And he has this amazing quote. I will just read it in full. I hope you guys can take it. It may therefore occur to spirit as it rises above the world of the senses and recognizes its own essence, as it seeks an element for the pure representation of it, for the expression of its essence, before it grasps thought itself as this element and wins the purely spiritual expression for its exposition. It may occur to spirit to choose number, this inner abstract externality, as the element. And then he goes on to say, number constitutes the final stage in an imperfect grasp of the universal still encumbered by the senses. The ancients were clearly aware that number stands midway between the senses and thought. Aristotle cites Plato in his Metaphysics as saying that the mathematical determination of things, being outside both the senses and the ideas, stand in between them. Now he's going on again. These ancients at the outset saw quite rightly the inadequacy of numerical forms for thought determinations, and they just as rightly went on to demand for thought, instead of that first expedient, the expression appropriate to it. This is how much farther ahead they had come in their reflection than those who nowadays consider it praiseworthy, indeed profoundly sound, to revert to the helplessness of childhood, and in the place of thought determinations to reinstate numbers themselves and numerical determinations like powers, blah, 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 as putting forth ultimate truth. So if there's any representative who is for numerical thought, if you could call it that, it would be Alain Badiou, grounding his ontology in set theory. Now Hegel is saying here that the ancients already knew that number was something between senses and thought, or at least standing in their midway. And I think this is at once super mysterious, because You know, it seems like usually it's seen as the most abstract thing, numbers and things of that nature. But I think it has to do with the fact that, you know, numbers relate to each other in arithmetic in an external fashion, with subtraction and addition. Hegel also relates it to the actual education or the building of spirit in regards to morality, and to like keep yourself busy with like to want to perfect yourself as a machine is you're sacrificing something and you're losing something there. Yeah, anyway, I wanted to know what you guys thought about this.
Well, I'll just comment, and Mr. Ebert, good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well. And it's very interesting because basically when you say the phrase midway, basically what David Hume wants to argue is that all real thing, like for humans to be the philosophical man that is still simultaneously man and doesn't abstract himself from his humanity, he must exist in a midway point. And I could read it out of the Equity of Concerning Human Nature, because where he's going to say, like, the mere philosopher is a character which is commonly but little acceptable in the world as being supposed to contribute nothing either to the advantage or pleasure of society, while he lives remote from the communication with mankind and is wrapped up in principles and notions equally remote from their comprehension. Don't you love it how they wrote back then? It was all elegant and it's full of like jabs and insults, but it's so pretty you can't even tell. On the other hand, the mere ignorant is still despised, nor is anything deemed sure sign of an illiberal genius in an age and nation where the sciences flourish than to entirely destitute of all relish for those notable intimates. Here's the key: the most perfect character is supposed to lie between those extremes, retaining an equal ability and taste for books, company, and business, preserving the convention of discernment and delicacy which arise from the polite letters, and in business that property and accurately which are a natural result of a just philosophy. And so for Mr. Hume, philosophy has to maintain a place where it is not a pure abstraction, but it also has the ability to organize itself in common life in a manner that can also lift that common life to a higher state, right? Now, by higher state, that means seen higher doctrical. He's not meaning like an elitist culture, but this is the man who loved to play cards. What he is saying is that one, as a philosopher, must exist in a midway point. And it is quite interesting to think of mathematics as having some sort of hint as being a kind of midway point between, you can count numbers in the world, but then numbers have a certain abstract level to it as well. And so what we have to see, what David Hume is constantly warning against, is the tendency of using philosophy to stop being a man, is the language he kind of uses, to stop being human, which requires somehow occupying a midway point between a state of not being philosophical at all, which is problematic because then you can't reflect to protect your common life, and then you fall into the banality of evil of Hannah Arendt. But then there's falling into what he calls the false or bad philosophy, where you're abstracted from the ability to relate to the world in which you are in. So then he's like, so we have to rethink what philosophy is. And the science of man, which is a key phrase in the treatise, is my Barnes and Noble version of the treatise, because I couldn't afford the Cambridge one because it was really freaking pricey all those years ago. The science of man is the midway art. See, this is the problem. When they used to use the word science, like in German, science can mean just rigorous study. Today, we have a notion of what science means, so we get a little confused. Now, that doesn't mean it has nothing to do with it, but the science of man is figuring out that between space. And it's interesting to think of math, if we can even determine what is math, how do we arise to math? And then this makes me think of the magnificent presentations that Mr. Rupas and Dr. Hamerlich were giving on mathematics, that on the science of logic. Like, what exactly that is may be an insight into the constitution of the character of the right kind of philosophical insight that is not going to lead to a abstraction and effacement of the human being in the world. And yet, strangely enough, the experience of math tends to lead us into a direction of thinking we can reduce the world to numbers, right? And well, that's exactly what Hume said happens with philosophy. The tendency with philosophy is to think that now we can reduce the world to a philosophical vision or control the world into that philosophical vision. So it's what came up for me as you were speaking is how there's like, it's interesting how both of these things are necessary, and yet in their very necessity bring with them a certain kind of danger or risk with them of being lost in. But let me pass it back to you, Dimitri.
So how do we differentiate this philosophy that's definitely about ethical questions from Aristotelian ethics, which is also about not going too far into a virtue because then it comes a vice, and it's kind of this entails this like almost like liberal centrism, right? Where you don't want to go too much far left or too far right, but you kind of want to do it both. Like what do you think about that?
That's a great question. I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert. Definitely, I think it's important to realize that I don't think Aristotle would be extremely interested in, like, when we say middle, middle can be dangerous, but it's more like fittedness. Like, maybe the most extreme thing is what's fitted for a given situation, and then another one is something more extreme. But the ability to discern what is quote unquote fitting, given the particulars of the situation, of which requires a certain I use the word middle, which, and I have in I did use that term, but it's because but there's a danger in that term, because it's not necessarily saying like the lukewarm center, or if you got one person that says, let's make a bridge, and another person says, let's not make a bridge. Well, let's compromise and make half a bridge. That's not so great. So we can't moralize the center, but there is something interesting when it comes to the way the brain works. You can't have a mono epistemology or a single way of thinking or a single mental model. You have to have this ability to see what is fitting, to possibly discern what is fitting. And that's where I think you start seeing in the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle a lot of why he's always emphasizing kind of the being in the situation, the determination of the situation, the wisdom, the humility, and all those different things. But that's a very good question. Let me give it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, I hope you're doing well today.
Thank you. I mean, so I guess my comments on the middling stuff is, I've been thinking about this a lot. Peter Limberg was asking me, he's like, when are artists going to be apolitical? Like, see beyond the pop. I was like, we've been apolitical a lot. The thing is, there's no such thing as apolitical. So neutrality is like a sort of a myth. You can have something that's neutral, but it only plays into the hand or of the dominant force. You neutralize alkalinity with acidic. If you just provide a base, it just sort of dampens it, but it's still, the dominant force still speaks. But anyway, a quantum is theoretically like a smaller piece, a more independent piece than quantity. Quantity is sort of this, big sea of stuff, kind of like being. Quantity and being, Hegel sort of equates. And quantum is the production of number. But within the production of number, within each quantum, is also a sea of indeterminacy within it, within the bounds, within the limitations of a given quantum. The number 2, is itself indeterminate within its own form. And otherwise it couldn't exist, because it has to exist. It comes into existence vis-a-vis sublation. And the only real neutrality in Hegel that I read is something, and he calls it equilibrium as well. It's equilibrium. So 0 is a decent way to think about a number that is literally completely in between the entire real number line. You have an infinite amount of negatives and an infinite amount of positives, and that equilibrium in and of itself, though, is the number line itself. Is the existence of a line without determinate quantums assigned to it. So it's just a line, and I love that, and I go through that a lot in the Hegel paper for the first paper that Cadell put out that we all contributed to. But there's a line in Hegel where he says, the dialectic, the point, will become the line. The dialectic, the line, will become the plane. So a line plus a line going through it. In other words, the point, through its own infinite relation to itself, becomes a line. And that line the point is in equilibrium. It's 0. It's just a point. It's nothing. And then it becomes a line. That line is also just nothing. It's in equilibrium. It has no assigned value, but it can host assigned values. And then that line, through its own infinite relation with itself, contradicts itself and becomes a plane across that. And what's cool about the plane is that it's the first instantiation of an actual objective 0, a point that exists at the crosshairs of two indeterminate lines.
Doesn't
Anyway,
he say
but
it becomes a circle? Doesn't he say it becomes a circle? The line becomes a circle?
it becomes a plane.
Where does he say that?
You
Where-
might
where
be
does he say
referring to
that?
a different quote.
Yeah, there is also a quote where he says the line becomes a circle.
Sure, that makes sense. That makes sense too. Yeah, but these equilibriums, like these equilibrium points, are really interesting to me because they're static. They are zero. They reset us, but they're not nothing. They're a nothingness of everything. And that's the best part about the Hegel stuff to me. But anyway, so that there really is no in between, except for there is no neutrality, is what I would say. Like in response to Daniel's bit about Hume and whatnot.
No, I really like that, and I should note that that's very interesting to think. And jump in and correct me if I'm incorrect. To think so. One, there's an equilibrium that is a point, but a line is an equilibrium that can kind of house determinations. It can kind of house things on them, right? That's quite interesting because that would suggest that not all equilibriums are the same, right? And to incorporate that, because we were talking a bit about David Hume, because I've got all the Hume books around me and the science of logic. I'm like, oh, right, I'm supposed to talk about this. Hey, and you're with me too, so we're gonna have a great old time. And what's very interesting is basically a way to look at what Hume is warning is that if you quote unquote stay in common life without philosophy, you're a kind of point. You have equilibrium, but you're just a point. But then if you go to philosophy and you get disconnected from common lived experience, you're also a kind of point because you can't hold the determinations of common life on you. You become a vacuous kind of abstract reasoning that nothing can hang on because everything can be undermined. So there's a way, as you were speaking, I was thinking, like, definitely with Hume, a return to common life, which is not necessarily just a return to where you were born or something, but a return to lived experience and valuing the lived. That almost makes you have a new equilibrium of a line in which you can then hang the determinations of philosophy or hang ideas on it. So you actually now have a new kind of equilibrium as you go and return to common life. Whereas if you stay in common life at just a point, where if you go into philosophy and just stay at the ivory tower, you only have a point. So you have to come back to have a reset of an equilibrium that can actually, house life on it, per se. So it's very interesting to think of what you were just saying as situated with Hume. Because definitely for Hume, this is why he pushes back against, like, the common sense philosophy of like, we don't need philosophy at all. We'll just stay in common life and be quote unquote practical. He said, that's dangerous. That's not what we're saying. But then he's also like, but look at all of these philosophers who think they know how to run people's lives. That's dangerous also. So it's a return to where you have almost a new equilibrium. That's a very interesting way, as you were speaking. And I'll also note when you were saying about arts, that you're right. Like, if arts we're not going to be political, that's a political act. The issue is how to do great art that is saying something meaningful that could have political, philosophical, whatever ramifications, that doesn't sacrifice the quality of the work in the process, right? I mean, nobody looks at Orwell and say, well, this book sucks because it's political, right? Like, there are plenty of books in history that are political, and we don't accuse them of being bad art just because they have political messages. I think a lot of times when people say art should not be political, what they mean is that the art should not be sacrificed for a political message. In the same way that art should not, like, sacrifice itself for a religious message. You see that all the time, right? Unfortunately, the more and more people say something, the words do their thinking for them, and then can develop kind of a knee-jerk reaction against any site of ideas in art or politics or different things like that. So that right there is the balance, in the same way that Hegel is warning that we can't avoid politics, we can't avoid all of these different things. The question is the equilibrium from which we are considering those things. And for him, it would, like, using your language, which I find very interesting, it's the line instead of the point. So those are things that came up for me, but let me give it back to Mr. Ebert, and then I will give it to Chetan.
I talk about this all the time, but the stupor of the drunkard, or we've talked about this actually together, the stupor of the drunkard versus the stupor of the enlightened are interchangeable. They're fungible. They're isomorphic. There's no difference in the interior. because they're both these equilibriums, and you cannot actually compare one equilibrium to the other within the qualitative, from the standpoint of the qualitative. But from the standpoint of the form itself, there's a big difference, you know. So the external form, you're like, well, that's an enlightened guy and that's a drunk piece of shit. I can tell. But internally, they're experiencing the same thing. But one's capable of more. So it's like, you know, just talking about the difference between the point and the line and the plane. For anyone who's confused by this, of course, I mean the Cartesian plane, not an airplane. Anyway, I just wanted to add that. Cheers.
No, let me give it to, I really like, well, again, to basically following Hume, he is saying that in order to tell the difference between those two, you have to have the return to common life. Because if you're at a point, there is a point, you cannot tell the difference between the points. You have to add another dimension, ergo the quality, ergo the line. Now you can tell the difference. And now there's a different way they carry themselves. But so basically for Hume, he's like, oh my gosh, we basically defined the only two options for the human subject as one's a point, and there's no way to tell the difference. And then there's all sorts of unintentional consequences that come with that, ergo the kind of return, ergo a lot of the project of the whole, what I call modern counter-enlightenment. So I really like how you put that. But Chetan, good to see. I was going to harass Javier on his recent video, frick, and he left on me. Stupid school. Chetan, good to see you, sir.
Yeah. But on two things, this question of art and politics, I think Ronsen has very interesting framing for the question that art can never be separated from politics, because art and politics both act on the same domain. What he calls the distribution of the sensible, in that sense, that eventually the plane on which these two things sort of are acting upon is the same plane. So you always find in some senses art can never be completely disentangled from its own political, in that sense, dimension, and politics cannot never be completely disentangled from aesthetics in that sense. And it's an interesting question to think about. How do we think through this question of apolitical in the context of art in that sense? I think that question becomes much more interesting. That how do we think, what would be in apolitical art in that sense? What is an imagination for it? What is the framing for that kind of a, rather than the reverse question that why does art need to be political? I think that's in some senses given. On the question of the middle, actually, there's something extremely interesting about the middle in Hegel, actually, in that sense. I remember reading Zupantik's book on Nietzsche, where she sort of writes that a very, very interesting line that she uses, that if there's an end, that end is in the middle. In that sense, that end is always the middle. The idea being that minute you actually has the split, minute one becomes two. The middle is what is holding the tension between the two things in that sense. And that she's using Nietzschean idea of the high noon to make that point, where the short shadow is the shortest. That's the point of the middle in the day. The middle, in some senses, always is this point of inauguration. It's very different from Aristotelian middle, that the Dimitri's question that was there in that sense. The Aristotelian middle is a middle at which is sort of balancing these two other in that sense. But this is the middle from which things are originating, things are inaugurating themselves. Both the future and the past sort of emerges from that middle. The linear time that we construct is a time that is emerging from that middle event in that sense. It is not something which is given to you in the past or will be given to you from the future in that sense. It emerges from that moment on both the sides. When you start thinking, and this sort of the kind of thinking, it completely fits into what sort of Ebert was saying, that there is no neutral position possible. But that lack of neutrality itself sort of emerges at the side of the middle. It doesn't completely take over the middle. It's not like there is no middle anymore. The one way to think about lack of neutrality is that there is no middle anymore. The other is that lack of neutrality actually is the side of the middle itself. Is the point of the middle itself, the point at which things originate. So even if you look at, say, Lacan's object R is exactly this problem that a certain kind of misrepresentation is the site of where object can be cognized. Object I is nothing that point of misrepresentation, isn't it? That background which always is disavowed to you, which you cannot know. It's within that background only the object becomes available to you, which is very interesting dialectical point in Lacanian thinking. But what he's actually getting at is this problem of the middle emerges in all of these framings. That it only through this point of the event, that both future and the past, that a certain kind of object becomes gets open to you for representation, cognition, playing, so on and so forth. Without that opening, in some senses, the object itself, without that imperfection, without that incompleteness of the object itself will get closed off to you. There will be no object. So far from that incompleteness being an object's downfall, that incompleteness is a condition of the cognition of the object. And that is the site of the middle in that sense. And I think, and one can get into
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Okay, a very naive one. In the middle of what?
See, as I said, middle inaugurates its own other positions. So middle itself tells you what is in the middle of what. The other things don't decide what is in the middle of this. Middle tells you what it is the middle of. So one way to think about it, it's a middle of between two subjects, as Daniel was trying to sort of show us in Hume, that the two subject positions and the event sort of cuts the middle. I think
one way to, instead of thinking of it as middle, for people who might be like middle of what, in between is I think the easiest way to think of it, as Chetan mentioned, because in between, like you're in between hungers, you're in between sexual desires. You've just come and you're suddenly at equilibrium. You don't have any sexual desire, but now that's the new background against which the new sexual desire will emerge. So there's always just this in-betweening.
Yeah, just a quick response to the threads that are running live. Chetan, when you said the end is the middle, I had this very, very visual, felt sense of death moving from the horizon of existence to the center of existence. And that feels like a very significant realization for me to play with. So if that feeds into what we're talking about, then that's great. I also wanted to respond to what Alex said about the relationship between politics and art that seems to be kind of running underneath this conversation. There's something about these statements of there not being a politically neutral position that feels like politics making a totalizing move into all other domains. And there feels like there's a very subtle distinction between that and art being somehow like something that touches on all domains, or it somehow includes all domains, or has all domains flow through it insofar as the artist is like fully engaged with life in the world. Then politics becomes part of that, but it's almost like the vibe of that being in contact with it is distinctly different to the vibe of that statement. And I don't think necessarily in how you conveyed it, but it's a sentiment that's moving around in the culture right now, and it does seem to be a kind of inverse totalizing move.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends how we define politics. If politics are the flows and operations of power, then simple rhetoric, simple communication, like we're just constantly involving ourselves in flows and operations of power. We're influencing each other. We're influencing our behavior just in this conversation. And in that sense, I do think it's all encompassing. But yeah, I mean, there are really great examples when art in general decided that it was apolitical, especially right after the hippie movement, and we had a collective embarrassment of earnestness and effort. And there's that great movie Hypernormalization, which has this moment where they're toting around Joan Jett or someone I can't remember, and they're driving her through the sort of dregs of New York 1978 or something, and it's like impoverished and all of that, and she's part of the youth culture, and her response to seeing all this was emblematic of an apolitical approach, which was, man, look at all this graffiti, it's so cool. Man, this is real living down here. This is where like people are really living down here. This is where I want to live. Not, damn, these capitalist conditions are really degrading and like, you know, income inequality should change, but like, this is cool. And I appreciate that. Like I've suffered, I've slummed it. I appreciate that whole vibe. But what ended up happening is documented in that documentary. New York bankers just were able to take over the city unopposed because youth culture was really into the idea of not protest. Like protesting was dumb. That was to be earnest and political. That was irrelevant. And growing up, even through the 90s, there was very little politics. Like Live Aid, being like really caring was lame. And you can see through the 80s and 90s like what effect that had. So I don't know, you know, I think there's ways to be apolitical, but they only contribute to the dominant force of power.
Mr. Luber, please. I was just going to note, because I want to talk about your book on theme and story writing, which I think is outstanding for this. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too. This is such a good conversation. It sucks I'm at work, so I'm like juggling like a bunch of things, and this is just, I kind of lost some of my thoughts that I was going to jump in and say, but to talk about art and politics, I totally understand the notion of power driving politics, but the underlining, what underpins it all is just the hermetic situation, the understanding. So in my mind, like when someone is doing something for like a power move, so to speak, it's because in their mind, if it goes their way, then they're in a quote unquote good situation. And that to me is more of the ethics domain than the power domain, because in the sense what's actually driving them is what is good in their mind for them, and they're projecting that in a sense onto others. But art and politics, I just think politics is just they're talking about the same thing. Politics just emphasizes ethics, and in my mind, art emphasizes like authenticity. I really want to read Hegel. Every time you guys just like go about Hegel, it's like holy fuck, and then that quote is just fucking insane. But I'll pass it on to someone else.
Well, I just wanted to note, so there's something very interesting here where, so in your book on theme, which again, everyone should watch your conversation at the Meaning Code over there with Alex, I really enjoyed. It seems like the problem is when you have art, it's the problem seems to be when art is leading to a political message as opposed to having the political message be the theme of the entire art. So in the same way that we're talking about this between space where you move it back, and Jacob was talking about bringing death to center. So the problem, like basically in Heidegger, right, is that death is something at the end of life as opposed to something that is actually existing with life. Like I've actually come, and Mr. Ebert, I've actually, it made me think of you. I've actually come to think that we need to stop thinking of death as the opposite of life, because death is what gives life quality and character and is actually an intricate part of it. And actually the opposite of life is what I just want to call anti-life, basically. Like anti-life is like not being born, not experiencing, like not existing is the opposite of life. Whereas death is actually the quality, it adds quality to life. So I've started talking about life versus anti-life. And so it's funny to think, I'm not sure if death is actually the opposite of life, as opposed to the condition that life needs to embrace to have quality. And so the thing I think about that, like the issue with art is, if I use Mr. Luber's language of theme, like a theme is something that every scene of the story should point to and participate in, right? And that's what makes a good story. Why is Flannery O'Connor a good Christian writer? Because the Christianity doesn't feel poured in from the top. It doesn't feel like her stories are for the sake of some propaganda message. What's happening is the movement of the bull in Greenleaf as a bull running across the field in of itself participates in a theological theme that you could read the story and not even know is there, right? And yet it is there if you see it. And he's making a point that grace actually has to be violent. So he's trying to push back against all of these Christians who say grace is kindness. He's like, no, grace is a slap across the face that makes you wake up to reality. And so there's a theme there. And yet the reason Flannery O'Connor is far superior to, say, The Shack or something is because in The Shack, it feels like the art is sacrificed for the theological message, right? It's not, the theological message is not a theme of the story, but the point of the story. And so likewise, I think there's a problem of art that's point is politics as opposed to the theme of it be political. Because here's the issue. All art must have a theme. It cannot avoid it. And to Mr. Luber, your point in your book, if it doesn't consciously operating according to the theme, it's still going to point to one. It's just going to be some fragmented mess, and it's not going to have control over what it's pointing to. And then you give rise to a world that doesn't have any political protesting because people weren't paying attention to what the theme was that they were pointing to, and it has an unintended consequence. So you can't avoid having art participate in a theme. It just, if you don't know that, you may just suck at it. Or you're gonna make the art an end to the political or theological or philosophical message or whatever, as opposed to pulling that to the middle and having it be the theme of which the whole thing is constantly participating in and unfolding, right? And this is where I'm using Mr. Luber, the Heideggerian language, which I do think is quite useful. What's also interesting about this is then, funny enough, if art pulls the politics to the middle to become the theme of the story, then it's like it's not even a political art. That's the weird thing. It's like the politics vanishes. It's actually now just good art. In the same way where there's that super, and this is where I'm pissed that Javier left, because this is what he was talking about and we were talking about. In the same way that the weird move happens in Lacan, where once you realize that lack is a feature as opposed to a result of a loss of an object, then lack becomes a kind of feature. And in a way, it's not even lacking anymore, because it is an incompleteness, right? It's not really lacking. It's like the constitution of the subject. So once you bring lack to the center of the ontology, there's a way in which it stops even being lack and yet is lack at the same time, right? And the same way that when you bring death to the center of life, it almost stops being death. Now it's a qualitative enhancer of life. The moment you bring the politics of art to the center of the art, it becomes the theme, and now it's not even political art anymore. And yet it's even better. The funny thing is, writers like Flannery O'Connor end up being far superior, quote unquote, religious writers, precisely because they don't seem to be religious writers. In the same way that a lot of the best political art ends up not even seeming to be political art because it's thematically political as opposed to trying to reach a political end. And so that's also interesting because it makes me think as well that what is a line, but when you draw a line between 2 points, and then it's like the points vanish and now it's a line. So once you add that qualitative dimension to Mr. Ebert's thing, like a line is between points, right? And then it's as if there are not points. It sublates and negates the point into a line. So there's something about the line that also is a between space that once it manifests, it's as if there isn't a between space. That's now the dimension of which you are operating on. The moment you bring politics into the center of the art, it's as if the politics is the art. It vanishes and then it becomes actually more successful in that work. So there's an interesting thing here that we're describing. Then I'll pass it to Chetan or whoever wants to speak, where it's the bringing the thing to the middle, then changes the quality and constitution of the thing that brought it to the middle, as if it's not even a middle that it brought it to, because it changes the entire character of the whole entity. And that would, of course, be the negation sublation. Right? And that seems to happen, Jacob, when you bring death to the center of life, then what life is changes, and it's negated into and sublated into something else, in the same way that once you bring politics into the center of art and it becomes the theme, then the art actually becomes something more powerful. It becomes something else in a way, an artistic quality. So it's interesting how this move has that reconstitution figure. But let me pass to it. And Jacob, I see you on Paul, so I can pass it to you. And then whoever wants to speak.
Super briefly, the sense coming for me, from my own recent foray into writing poems and trying to rap them, is that it's not necessarily that I'm moving towards politics as such, but that I'm getting in touch with aspects of myself, be it passion, aggression, conflict. These sides of self are correspondent with how I deeply respond on some somatic level to what's bullshit in the world, And so it's the integration of that, and that kind of creates more life essence for me. And just one other thing that comes to me is that we're in such a space where this question is incredibly relevant. I do think that there's a certain point at which this kind of network and philosophical engagement and artistic scene, when it gains more community and resilience and potency, that it becomes threatening to other forces in culture, then in a sense you do enter into the political realm. But it's not necessarily that you're of it, constituted by it, or about it. It's just like when you are contending in the power space, when power is flowing through you or through you collectively, then we are political in that way, I think.
Very nice, Jacob.
I remember what I was going to say.
Please, Mr.
Can I
Luger.
jump in real quick?
Please.
So I'm like fresh off of reading this book called Vertical Ascend, and it's by this guy named Wolfgang Smith. He's still alive. I just actually watched part of an interview that he just put out on theory of knowledge. But when the whole notion of the middle, what struck me was that it's coming from a paradigm where you're situated in not seeing the feedback loop in its entirety, because you're not seeing how the world is corporeal. You're just seeing it as physical stuff in terms of parts. So I think when you start taking into account how the world is corporeal, I think the in-between language is like, I like that better, but it still doesn't even take into account, because it's only in between because you're coming from it from like a physicalist. You're coming from like the current notion of science, essentially, in my mind. I'm not saying the current notion of science is like bad or wrong. It just literally doesn't take into account the corporeal, and it inherently relates to it. So the second you start talking about the corporeal realm, you kind of have to talk about it from a language standpoint of, we're talking from the physical domain. So it's an in-between. It's in between. There's something more than just what's physically present in front of us. There's this like something else, and hence you have to like use language, kind of trying to like scavenge your way out of the paradigm that like we're all situated in. If that makes any sense. And like corporeal, he basically talks about how there's these three realms: the avinternal, the intermediary, and the corporeal. And to me, just theme is just embodying the intermediary realm, and how if we look at art, for example, art and politics, through this intermediary realm, then we're inherently seeing it like corporeally. So in my mind, it's essentially seeing it in terms of what is moving our understanding. Is our understanding being moved in an authentic sense, or is it being moved in terms of what's good for us type of sense? And in that way, I think you can start seeing the story ontology kind of come to life a little bit, because you don't see things as like 100%. Kind of going to, I forget which interview Cadell had, but it was just the whole distinction of the 99% and the 100%, and just being able to like oscillate in and out of those domains.
And that Mr. Layman Pascal's Metaphysics of Adjacency, where 99% is new, 100% is quite lovely. And that Theory of Everything channel is pretty freaking great. Wolfman Smith, I think also he was on the Meaning Code at some point. And also I will note what's very interesting is you're just describing the horrific problem that language always has to have a reference dimension, basically. Like when we speak, we have to be referencing either a dimension where there's sequential time, or a dimension of, say, that takes place in a fiction book, or a dimension of non-sequential time. And so that's always the problem, because like you can end up talking about something where you talking about it in a sequential space, like as we experience time is adequate. And then you reach a moment in the conversation where you're now talking about, say, vertical causation, and it like reaches back in time and makes the previous way you were talking about it seem like it was erroneous. But up to that point in the conversation, it was an adequate frame. And now you need to transition the frame. And this goes to show you like why language is kind of difficult. It's actually why I think Derrida, you know how like Derrida critiques them all the philosophers as saying writing sucks, but when I speak, then it will work. And he's like, no, you use the writing to hide. Actually, this can hint at why writing might be uniquely able to move between the stack of all of these different dimensions, because you can use like parentheses and dashes and stuff like that. But I'd have to expand on that point. But let me give it to Chetan.
Quickly, I would, I think, go back to that question of art and politics that we were, sort of thinking through. And one of the things actually interesting about this term apolitical is that apolitical is actually trying to find some sort of a neutral position vis-a-vis politics in some senses, isn't it? It's seeking some kind of protection against the political realm. It's a political realm itself becomes too heavy, too much for that, and how do we think through that kind of a question? I think one of the interesting things about politics is that politics has always been associated at least with the problem of distribution, isn't it? That politics essentially is a problem which emerges because you need a certain sphere, a certain realm within the human system, at least within the domains that we are symbolic beings, such that it acts like an escape valve. It acts like a point at which we can engage in a certain realm where the incompleteness can be finally negotiated with. That realm becomes politics, isn't it? Which is why politics always is associated with violence. It will always have that link with power and violence, because politics becomes that realm where incompleteness finally finds its resting domain, in that sense. That human beings cannot find a final resolution to any. If you could have complete rules for our engagement, we don't need politics. We need politics because no matter what rules we make, we would eventually have to politically negotiate. There is no escaping that. There cannot be any consistent rules which can define all our modes of, Yet we know that this realm, historically, since the Greek time, and I'm reading this great book by Hannah Arendt called Human Condition, where she is sort of distinguishing between the world of necessity, the bodies, and our ability to sort of engage with our survival, and this question of public sphere, where only those people can enter who have risen above the question of their basic necessities. If you're still embroiled with your basic necessities, in Greek states, for example, you're not considered fit to enter into the public sphere, isn't it? So there is something about that problem. And argument essentially becomes that we all need a private sphere. One cannot simply argue that everything is political. That kind of argument fails because that takes away any kind of private sphere where something can be developed such that it can later come into the political public life. If everything becomes political, that means you don't have any private life left. Isn't it? You don't have an underlife in that sense. So once you start thinking this through, this kind of a problem of politics, that at one level, everything potentially can be political. But to make everything immediately political means to take away that very space from you in which something can be created for the public life, in that sense, which is the private world, which is a world in which you finally come to rest, you secure yourself, you can think freely, because the thought, as far as thought is an action, can itself is protected from the consequences of the action. Am I right? Thought is an action, but it also needs a protection from the consequences of action. That's what thought does. And that is only possible once this kind of minimal protection against political realm becomes possible. And one starts thinking that when you start thinking about art in this context, and I'll just quickly finish it in 1 or 2 minutes. Art is a very interesting thing that as Freud sort of thought about it in one of his papers, that when you think about art is not simply this relationship between pleasure principle and reality principle, that you go and do something in the world. Art is when you do something for pleasure's sake itself. when the reality of it emerges from you creating something for the sake of pleasure itself. And then two people can find reality within it. It doesn't have this direct relationship with reality in that sense that, other activities are seeking. How does such an activity, which is sort of moving away from direct relationship with reality in that sense, itself becomes the place of politics? I think that's the kind of question we are seeking. And at what point an activity like this, which doesn't need to have the direct relationship with reality as we're thinking, itself starts seeking a certain protection from politics? At what point politics becomes so heavy for it that it needs to be protected from it? It needs a certain privatization such that it says that the public sphere, and in some senses, art becoming apolitical is a claim on the territory that how you're interpreting on my art. It's not simply how my art is or what my art is. It's a claim on how you will interpret my art. The public sphere is a sphere where anybody can come and engage with reason in that sense. Anybody can give any opinion to you, and you have to engage with that opinion. Your opinion has a value in that sense. It's not simply a fear of truth, isn't it? So at what point does art becomes an object which needs to be protected from the public sphere? I think that's the question of the apoliticalness of art, and which we need to, I think about as I was saying before. Yeah, thank you.
Those are great questions. I mean, to me, my answer would be that art is protected in privacy with the lacuna of the sort of the artistic process at the very beginning, upon inception, enjoys that privacy. As soon as it becomes a commodity or is made public, it certainly becomes political in my view. And I'm thinking about whether or not it can be shared amongst a cohort of people without any commerce attached to it, in an enclave of sorts, and remain apolitical, and just be enjoyed for its own sake without generating any politics amongst that group. It's possible. It's possible. So it's not that the art, like you were saying, I mean, for me, art doesn't even carry meaning. The meaning is created in the person who absorbs the art. And if we're talking about middles and in-betweens, this is something I'm really passionate about. Like, I'm going to make a piece of art right now. Here we go. What is that? What does that mean? Right? It's a muffin pan and a hat. Now, all I did was provide the in-betweens. The person making the art out of that, making the meaning, is you. You have to extract meaning from in between the determinate objects. And even if it's a single object, you orientate yourself around that object, and you create a constellation of other pieces of meaning, and you figure out what it means to you. Like, I hold this up and it's like, what is that? It's vitamins? It means health. Whatever the case is, I'm not creating the meaning, you are. And so my question is, like, even in the context of simply sharing a piece of art, what I'm sharing is I'm offering you some in-betweens, and you, as the viewer or enjoyer, are going to extract meaning from it. And I guess the question is, can that process of extracting meaning, and meaning is no modest thing, meaning impacts us, meaning affects us. Can we extrapolate from the extraction of meaning out into behavior and affect in a way that does not touch the political? And I don't know, I'd have to think about that.
Okay. My point, Alex, is that if you're allowing me to extract meaning, that sphere is political. Then you cannot escape politics. If you're allowing me to extract the meaning, if you're giving me that agency, then you enter into political realm by definition. The challenge is at what point an artist feels that my extracting meaning from your art becomes violent upon the artist itself. That's the
Well, I
apolitical
mean,
one.
look, that's a really good question. And
No.
it's something I rail against all the time. Like, to me, what they teach in school is that you should really know your what do they say? Your audience. Who's your audience? So you're immediately being told that whatever you're producing is for public consumption, and that you should really triangulate your audience, their desires, the kinds of meanings they're going to extract, and then present in-betweens specifically for that group to extract them, at which point the very creation process has been fully infiltrated by political concerns. So the only way, there's some artists that we can imagine are purely artistic, like Daniel Johnston. They're people that are a little crazy. They're not thinking about people, right? They're literally like suffering from mental illness, and they never consider their audience. They're just making it in their bedroom, and they don't think about anything ever. And maybe that's a pure expression of art, where their art is taken unbeknownst to them, basically, and then sold to people. But I try and not think about my audience. But even then, by not thinking about it, I'm doing a political act. So it's very difficult.
Yeah, to me, the question is at what point my meaning of your art becomes violent upon you in that sense, as an artist. And that question intrigues me. At what point an artist creates an art for some kind of, meaning creation by others in that sense,
I think before you even absorb it, because in advance, I'm thinking, will they like it? I can imagine them listening to it. Oh, you can't even help it. It's like, oh, I can imagine them seeing this. Who's them? I don't know, but I can imagine someone else being here and listening to this. And all of a sudden, by imagining them, it's altering my view of it, and it's giving me a new perspective, and now I'm going to change it based on this imaginary person looking or listening or reading. And based on this imaginary person consuming my art, I'm now going to change my art to accommodate this experience of this abstract person who doesn't exist listening to my art.
Absolutely. The other interesting thing that you said, which I would sort of quickly say something, this distinction between comedy and public sphere, commodity and public sphere, comedy, I'm really sorry. Yeah, commodity and public sphere. Commodity itself is a certain kind of privation of the public life. If you think about it, commodity itself is a point of privation. It's a point, that is why it starts at the point of social. It's not public. Commodities can't survive the gaze of the public sphere. That's always been the challenge of commodity, which is why when at a point art becomes a commodity, it actually loses its political edge, because it goes into a sphere of what you call necessities. It can get equated. We can have a longer discussion upon why does this happen. A commodity itself is a point at which the public life is privatized. Marx saw it. Marx saw that problem in that sense. That's what his problem of commodity was. So this question of commodity actually is the reversal of that problem of public sphere in that sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting. That's an interesting. I see that happening with the Gen Z kids. It's sort of like art. I mean, it's sort of like, it's a reversal in which the full embrace of commoditization negates the political impact of commodity. This is always the case, these ironic inversions. You take something far enough, it reverses itself.
I wonder if there's something in the determination of who the they is in the context of you as the artist, how you imagine and relate to the they seems to be very consequential to the degree of freedom or the way in which politics impinges, or in which somehow there's a restriction or a distortion or a bending. And so maybe philosophy as the axe, or philosophy as the tool, or what have you. I don't know, perhaps the they begins at just you and yourself, and it expands as a circle outwards, but somehow you might have agency in shifting who is the relevant they. Like it could be bunch of random people, or it could be a very particular group of people, and the degree to which you're kind of honed to that will like afford how much freedom you have, how much like risk you're willing to take potentially, and all of those things.
I just to answer that real quick, I find personally that the they tends to be a group to which I want acceptance, which is highly political. So it'll be like a group that I would really like to love this. Like, oh, I'd love if these people loved that. You know, these are the people I would love to get validation from with regard to this thing. So it's totally problematic. Yeah.
There was a lot of good stuff said. I mean, my book is really addressing these topics a lot. For me, I just think of this very Heideggerian, like in terms of meaning and we appropriating meaning. I think it's more we're appropriating the essence of something, and it's not what essence, not meaning like, sorry if the walkies are fucking loud, but basically essence means to Heidegger like what endures, what lasts. And in that sense, it's not necessarily we're appropriating meaning where it's just something that's like particularly given to us. It's something that's broad and bigger than us because it lasts longer than the viewer. So that's why I agree you don't pay attention to the viewer. I mean, I preach that to like all my friends who are screenwriters and whatnot. Like they very much focus on the viewer and who it's going to, and I do the opposite. So I definitely think that's like a problem in the art, and it shows the political relationship to art. I completely agree. I just don't necessarily see politics in terms of, because even I don't necessarily agree of not looking at the audience as a political move, because if you're thinking about it in terms of like just like the metaphysics of what you are doing, I just don't see it having to do with necessarily like a subject. Like I think you could think about, sure, like you could think about the physics of the tree, but you don't need to think about how like the tree necessarily gives us like nutrients and how we relate to the tree. So I just think there's a way of looking at art where it's just like a physicist looking at a tree, where it's like, I'm just looking at a story for what a story is, understanding that the essence of a story is what I am looking at, and that is that which lasts or endures, and that is beyond me, because someone else outside of me can look at this, someone 100 years, 200 years, etc. And just being able to always I gotta stop talking, unfortunately. I have to pass it off. Sorry.
No, and I'll and again, Javier, we talked about at one point how once you realize lack is a feature, it's not lack anymore. It's like an incompleteness. So you missed that ball, friggin' jerk. But anyway, there is something very, very strange to Mr. Lubert's point, where precisely like seemingly to have an effective political message, you need to be able to examine a story, two-story state in its own operations. That precisely then actually increases the probability that it participates in a theme, of which then is more powerful than if the story was just a means to an end, or if the painting is a means to an end. So there's something interesting there. Now, a few things. The Fragility of Goodness by Martha Nussbaum makes this very interesting claim, where she says that the role of the Greek tragedy, Sophocles, and Antigone, or all of these different things, like they were very important because they taught people the nature of political operation, not what position to hold politically, but what exactly politics is doing. And a tragedy for Miss Martha is a trade-off of competing goods. So politics is not in the business, so what that was teaching, the role of art was to teach the framework in which you think about what politics is doing as a whole, not a particular political position. And this is where I think we see how art relates to politics. Because if you think politics is about problems and solutions, Well, then the name of the game is to find the solution and get rid of the problem. But what Martha's pointing out is that it was really important that people's experience of art taught them that life is not primarily made of problems and solutions, it's made of trade-offs. So then when people participated politically, they knew what they were doing. Now, the point of Sophocles was not to teach you what trade-off you should make, but the fact that it is trade-offs, that's the framework to think about politics. Another example, I would argue that the more art, a very large amount of art, not all art, but most of the art that people consume is basically a kind of melodrama. Good guys versus bad guys, right? If that's all you take in, then that leads you to then think that politics is a melodrama. Good guys versus bad guys. Now, I'm not saying there isn't any bad, and I'm not saying there aren't any problems that can be solved. But what I'm saying is that a role of art is to teach the framework in which you think about what exactly politics is doing. What I think people are trying to say when they say art should be apolitical is they're saying you shouldn't have two characters talking to one another where one of them is clearly right and the other is clearly an idiot, and this is how you should think. Like, that is not what art is supposed to do, where basically you're just using art as a vehicle for a political debate, right? And that would be correct. But you go too far if you fail to understand that art is an utterly necessary participant in the political process of teaching the framework in which people should think about what politics is doing. Because if you don't think about politics as involving trade-offs, tough calls between, are you going to save the environment and cut down on GDP, privacy, freedom, all these different things, then basically the reason why your society doesn't work is because of the other guy, the bad guy, the other party. And now you have a melodrama because you have the wrong framework by which to think of politics. Now, the other thing I'll say that's very interesting on this problem that Chetan is bringing, and at what point does the violence arrive at, there's almost an issue here where a distinction has to arise between the art and the artistic product. Because what ends up happening is the word art becomes a simile for both, right? The process of making the art and the object of which the process arises to. It would seem as if the moment an object is created, then we have the muffin pan with the hat on it that I want to buy for 50 G's, as Mr. Luber put forth. We now have an object, right? And that seems to be now where we have an issue. And it's almost inevitable that violence come upon the artist at some point. Maybe 90% of people don't, but 10% do. You know, there's some sort of space there that becomes quite difficult. Now, is there a way, in the same way we talked about bringing death into the middle, bringing the theme into the middle, is there a way to bring the product into the process, to bring the object of art into the process of art? Because that's where now we seem to be talking a way to avoid the political problem. Perhaps the closest example of this is something like dance, right? Like dance, especially if it's not recorded, like it's only a live experience, right? And it's a dance of which when you experience it so good that it's all, like Mr. Ebert, it's ineffable. Because it's almost like the moment you can put it into words, you have this commodification problem, right? But if you're seeing the live processes unfolding of the art, where the process of the art is the object of the art, therefore you're bringing the end to the between, like we talked about death, that seems to start working against the violence you're warning about. And the all experience, so it's almost like this. It's almost like what art needs to do is in its initial encounter, have this all ineffable experience where the line between object and process is collapsed. So it's brought into, the object is brought into the middle, into the between, into the line per se. And then now it's inevitable that eventually you start speaking again, right? So you'll have the inevitable all, and then after the dance, you may talk about what it meant to you. Once it moves into determining the meaning, that's where it seems that the meaning needs to be framework discussion. You see, so we talked about where art is about framework. So the meaning we extract from art should be on the ground of if we're talking politics, should be on the grounds of the framework according to which we think about politics. And then, of course, that would have impact on the subject and how relationships unfold. You know, they're not melodramas. They're learning how to work between subjects. And like the moment you talk about negotiation, you're talking about trade-offs, right? So it would seem as if there's a two-stage here, where there's an initial experience of the art itself that can bring you into a place of that awe or that suspension of the ineffable. And then after that, when words are reintroduced, when meaning is reintroduced, it needs to be on terms of frameworks. And that seems to be when you're starting to say, okay, the art is honored as being that creation of this all, but it's also having a political impact in that it's organizing frameworks by which you think of politics. And so then the question is, how does an artist create a work that has both of those functions? That the initial experience of the art is a certain ineffability, a certain, oh my gosh, did I just see that? Oh my freaking wow, you know, oh my gosh, that then once that ineffability, you know, you wake up the next day, does the art inspire framework consideration? And then, so that then when you carry yourself into the political realm, you have a better framework by which to engage in that operation. And we're not just doing the melodrama politics. Because it would seem to me, to close, the problem is art could help us escape melodrama politics. We seem to have almost a melodrama politics. And we also have kind of melodrama relationships and families. I'm not saying everyone, but there's a lot of melodrama. It would seem like a useful function of art would be to help us escape those melodramas, right? And to start thinking on more sophisticated frameworks by which to carry ourselves. That would be more full human, of which we may have the very motivation to do because of the initial experience of all that art granted us, that would then make us care to even engage in that. But with that, I'll pass it to who wants to speak.
Well, first of all, I just want to point out, you suggesting this is political. I don't like, for instance, and what I started thinking about immediately was jazz, especially jazz as it entered, you know, like the Giant Steps, Miles Davis era, Bird, Charlie Parker, and you have these little white kids going to see these guys, Jack Kerouac, you know, and they're like, oh my fucking God, right? So they're doing this thing where they're watching the process. There's no packaged art, there's no commodity. You do pay to go see the show, but the point is they're watching this unfinished processual happening, right? And it has these massive political implications. Now, I have to imagine that the undertaking of that processual, throw it to the wind, I'm going to say fuck it and do this, and not play the song as it's orchestrated, but improvise, is itself a political act, right? A sloughing off of the formalities is itself a political act. So I feel my own weird fucking like 18-year-old membership to the United Socialist Club. Like I can feel that guy wearing all black. That was me putting up resistance in this conversation. So I know there's something there for me. I know there's something I can look at, like why I'm so insistent that fucking art is political. And there's so many great examples I can see of artists thinking they're not political, being so hyper political that they're unaware of it, having all these impacts. But still, I'm struggling to see where like what you just suggested was beautiful. I would love to see that. I want to do it. But even the suggestion to do it, it seems like a political sentiment. Yeah.
Very, very important. In the same way that Hume wants to make extremely clear that you can never escape philosophy, therefore you have to do good philosophy, not bad philosophy. You can never escape politics. The question is it good politics or bad politics? And this is where Hume, you see, there's this horrible tendency now where all the philosophers online are different. They'll say, oh, I don't like politics. That's the people who are basically saying, oh, I don't do philosophy, who are like blue collar people. And they're like, I don't do philosophy. Hume's like, that's a philosophical act. And actually what Hume is so concerned about is he calls it the heroic ascension, where you're like, I'm above politics. He's like, that's really dangerous because it's like an ego feed. And that's actually what leads to bad politics, because you have all these people that think they're above politics. So the question is, what is good politics? Now, of course, that's a huge question. Hume, the reason why Hume resists so strongly the common sense philosophy is because it makes it as if you don't have to do philosophy. Likewise, he resists, he's got all this politics, all of this economics, because he's like, you cannot escape it. And in fact, if you think you escape it, you're going to feed the melodrama, or you're going to feed the problem solution or the tyranny or different things. So likewise, the artist cannot escape politics. The question is, in what way does artists do politics?
Well, so I just wanted to, so my second, okay, I agree. I was conflating your point and Chetan's point, but the artist can escape politics, and the audience can, in the moment of awe, when you have
Yes.
those moments and you are self-saturated and you're in a state, you've escaped categorical domination and you're in a momentary void, new equilibrium, but then you come back from it and you start to assess, and ascribe meaning. So we can't escape it. And the instance you're giving of like being in that state of awe and just like that's an escape from the political and an aha. And very often that the very act of escape reflects itself in the meaning to which you ascribe it when you come back to sort of normal life. And you're like, oh my God, we don't have to do X, Y, and Z. I was just outside of X, Y, and Z. I see now we don't have to do that because I was able to get beyond it. And so it gives us this sense of that there must be something beyond the current paradigm because we were able to escape it momentarily. Anyhow, but I guess my point is when I say art is political, yeah, it's obviously a rhetorical statement, but yeah, there's a better way to parse that, but art ends up being political. Let's say it can't help not ending up being political.
Yeah, the term is that it is ultimately political, like it cannot permanently be ultimate. And say for David Hume, this is really important what you're saying, and I'll pass it to Chetan and Javier. So for David Hume, you can in fact have experiences of common life that quote unquote escape philosophy, but not forever and not ultimately. But if you never had the moments and experiences of a life of like fully present and you're not existential all the time, then you would not, one, care to engage in that philosophy because there's no possibility of an all experience that makes it worth dealing with all that. And also, philosophy would never be humbled. And he thinks it's incredibly important that philosophy undergo humility because then it's actually better philosophy. It ends up truer philosophy because then it's like, oh, there's some value in this common life I should incorporate into my philosophy and therefore not be thinking independent of it or as if I am better than it. Likewise, if the artist goes, I cannot ultimately escape politics, well, maybe actually there's some good in politics because a world that doesn't have politics may lead to some sort of tyranny or some sort of problems. But how do I relate to that politics in a manner that I don't think I'm better in it, but that simultaneously is aware of the very real pitfalls and dangers of politics? In the same way that David Hume is common life is dangerous. It goes into fascism and Nazism and it goes into closed-mindedness. And yet common life, everyday lived community can be also a beautiful thing. But how do you navigate it? See, all of this comes down to a navigation, literally the skill itself. Like the skill itself of making the art, the skill itself of doing the philosophy. And for David Hume, though, if it's not aware of this problem we are describing, the likelihood of the skill being trained and developed to navigate these territories is basically like none. It's very, very low. So that's why for Hume, you can't escape philosophy because you have to eat, like this whole net conversation is a reflection of a problem that you need philosophy to do to see that there are times where philosophy should be in service of common life. Right? Like this entire conversation has a necessary reflective element to make you even realize there's some sort of navigation the artist has to carry out as they're doing their work. So philosophy cannot be replaced by quote unquote common sense. But if you carry out this reflection, the danger is you get stuck in the reflection and you never then come out of it, right? Or the danger of examining the problems of politics is then you say, oh, I'm better than politics. And that's the move where now you've used he calls it like the philosophical arrogance. That's where you then have an arrogance where then you're like, I'm better than that. And that's actually precisely when the politics controls you, or you're now no longer a threat to it, or actually you feed the capture and different things. So this problem of the entire navigation seems to be quite critical. But let me pass it to Chetan, Javier.
Okay, I'll go because at this point I'm feeling like Zizek. I'm about to start having like itches and stuff, and like rubbing my nose if I wait any longer. So recently I've read Susan Sontag's book called Against Interpretation, which is this wonderful piece on art itself. And there's something interesting that she says. She says, in her opinion, it's very difficult to divide the ethical and the aesthetic. It's all there at once, right? So in point in case for Ebert here, if Susan Sontag says that the world itself is an aesthetic phenomenon, that means the political itself is an aesthetic phenomenon. And that means the aesthetic is political and the political is the aesthetic. So this is what I really like about her exposition on this. But I think that the problem that I'm trying to identify is where the violence is, because it's so difficult for people to separate the artist from the artwork. And Susan Sontag says something influential in the sense that despite the author's intentions, the artwork itself is relatively disinterested, which is kind of political already, the fact that she says that. But I found it really interesting because somebody in Davoud's book club actually raised an interesting point where it's like, it's difficult to detach the artist from the artwork because of the influential power in the very act of consuming that artwork, right? The very fact that it becomes a commodity, purchasing, just listening to it, gives credence to their influential power, and you start getting scared of their bad ideas, their sort of bad, for example, the example of Kanye got brought up, right? Of course. But I feel like the violence occurs right here between that exact division between the artist and the artwork, because people, I feel like artwork can be political, but I want it to be political in the sense that somebody encounters it the way Daniel's talking about, not because they encounter it in the sense that they want to understand it from the artist's perspective, which I think is useful, but at the same time, they're not willing to encounter it for themselves. And I think I understand why Susan Sontag is against interpretation in this case, right? She's against interpretation, and of course, against interpretation is definitely political, but I think it's that move where she's trying to make the political the aesthetic, like really make it the aesthetic, where we had it the other way around, right? We're trying to make the aesthetic political, and but I just had a lot to say on that, because I think she gave me a lot of thoughts, and of course I'm very curious to hear Ebert's thoughts on this and his response on this too as well. But yeah, I found it like such an impossible situation where it's like, because we make it a commodity, people are afraid to really encounter the art as the art itself, because already it's linked to the author's intentions in such a way, because they get the credence, they get the affordance of the money and the influence. So yeah, those are my comments.
Well, I'm trying to articulate something which I think is a little difficult in some senses, but I think what we're trying to discuss is an artist's relationship to his audience in some senses. Am I right? And one of the things, if we think about this relationship to aesthetics and politics, I think one of the things that comes to light is that no matter how distant aesthetics becomes from politics, it always has a minimal of relationship with politics left within it, and which it can't sort of undo. On the other side, no matter how distant politics becomes from art, which means it becomes as closer to violence as possible in that sense, it always retains a minimal of that aesthetic dimension, because without that aesthetic dimension, the very axis of politics and language gets lost. This link between politics and language, that politics eventually is linked to man being an animal who has access to language, like Aristotle very famously said. That link gets completely broken, and one has very famous Clausewitz line that war is politics by other means, and Foucault comes up and reverses it. Politics is war by other means in that sense. So politics and war in that sense always has this dual connection between one is there's a continuity between it, there's a discontinuity between it. In that sense. So when we start thinking of this artist's relationship to its audience, I think that we are putting too much of a burden upon the artist when it's saying that it can't have certain boundaries upon the audience. I don't think that's being apolitical. I think no matter how we interpret that side of artists having some imagination of his own audience, some boundary over there. In fact, I would think the necessary precondition of having a political or public realm would demand some kind of location of the members who are participating into it. Everybody can't participate into it. There will be some kind of limitation. And if the artist is putting it, I'm completely okay with it. That's not where I think the apolitical question starts to sort of begin with. The apolitical question starts that no matter which audience the artist is choosing for itself, the very interpretation of the art of the audience becomes a burden for the artist. It has nothing to do with it not having the right audience. It has something to do with no matter which audience it has. Still, the burden of that effective realm becomes a challenge for the artist. There's some stronger claim over there than simply people interpreting it in whichever way it can be interpreted. It's not a simple question of multiplicity. It's a question of location. No matter which location you have in that sense within the artistic community, the political dimension of the art still becomes a burden for the artist in that sense. So the artist is seeking an escape from its own art in some senses at that moment. That's what this problem of this apolitical art becomes. That an artist is trying to seek an escape from the burden of his own art. He's saying, please do not burden me with what I've created. I don't take any responsibility for it in that sense. And that, I think, is an interesting point to reach within the domain. And I think many artists are reaching it. I think that point gets reached only when art itself becomes an object of use. Objects of art are normally meant to be useless. If they find some concrete use in this world, they're no longer art in that sense. They become something else to one degree or another. Because using something makes it a question of necessity, drives, and so on and so forth. Art is an object which comes from that its relationship, as I said, is directly to pleasure in that sense, as Freud thought about it. That it's the affective realm that finds a link with an object of art. And when minute you make it a commodity, it becomes an object which finds other forms of uses rather than that effective use. That's the problem of the commodity in that sense. That commodity makes art, lose its artistic edge in some senses because it starts making it a useful object. It starts making it an object which has other purposes than the artistic. So at what point in that, and I think the political question then becomes, at what point artist becomes itself burdened by the artistic dimension of his own art in that sense, and how do we think through that structuring of the artist in some, it's an antithetical position to what Nietzsche was thinking about the artist in some senses.
My goodness, those images that Alex was talking about or evoking of the jazz club scene are just like so textured and vivid for me right now, and it's making me think, this is far too expensive for the bounds of this conversation, but I think we could well substitute art for something like psychedelics and see how the structure of the conversation changes or stays the same. Because when you take something like psychedelics, it seems to remove a little bit of that focus on this is something that's being actively created and more bringing it to the experience itself, which I think is what it feels very analogous to what Alex is talking about with this kind of boundary dissolving experience inside of the jazz club that has implications for politics, but ultimately it has a solvency on everything else. It's been a terrific dialogue, by the way.
Yeah, I agree. It's been amazing. And the dissolving of categories, if order has anything to do with categorization, and you experience awe and intercategorical moments or intercategorical monsters of the rock star who's a sphinx and a whatever, and you experience these moments that break the paradigm or momentarily sublate the paradigm, and you come back into the paradigm, you're like, wait a minute. So it's always going to have that sort of political effect. To Chichan's point, first to Javier's point about the aesthetic is the political, as opposed to the political is aesthetic. Sorry, the aesthetic is the political. Whichever way it was, where aesthetic is the dominant and politics is sort of an outgrowth of it. Absolutely. It's something I've been trying to figure out how to articulate for a while, and at the moment I talk about how the the superficial is the language of the profound, and that if you build it, they will come. And I have so many examples of, and there's of course like a sort of ecological feedback between the human and their environment, and we begin to change. You put on a suit, you ever put on a three-piece suit and suddenly you start acting like James Bond? Like you just suddenly have a different quality to you. We are deeply affected by the superficial, by language, the language we use, whatever it is, and so these moments of the superficial, I mean, you can almost chalk everything up to like, oh, why are you fascist? Well, it's because you actually just like that aesthetic. Like you find it like it looks cool. Like you just, that's it's not even to do, you're not even fundamentally racist. You just find it interesting and you're compelled by the aesthetic and you're like, yeah, and you get thrown into these fervors and you hear this guy talking and shouting and you're like, ah, and it's all just aesthetic. And I mean, you look at the aesthetic of like MAGA Trump supporters and it's such an aesthetic. I mean, it's like they're holding down such a fucking look, and vibe, and the barbecues and the whole thing. It's like a lifestyle choice. It's not even a belief system. And I just totally agree with that. And then lastly, I was just going to say to Chetan's point, success is one of these in-betweens in my experience. So success is a kind of death. It's a kind of equilibrium. It evaporates the moment you get there. You're like, what happened? Where to go? Like, where did the drive go? It's like coming and suddenly you're at an equilibrium point. And those equilibriums, they're inertia. They collapse the relation. They create an inertia where suddenly congratulations, you're a PhD, inertly now forever PhD, and it just never stops. You're now this. Or congratulations, you're a husband, and now you're just a husband forever, and this is what you are, and you're a rock star. Whatever the case is, you arrive, and you're now, you gain inertia, and the trade-off is you've become inert and dead to change. You're now just this thing. And the thing that I experienced as an artist is each time you create, you have a success, they're like, oh, you're that guy. You did that thing. I can't wait to hear that again. When's the next time you're doing that thing? And so you're like, okay, I have to obviously blow this up and create a new line of flight so that I can experience like actual creativity again. Yeah, so the personal brand epidemic, which is happening right now all over the place, is very detrimental to the creative process in general. Yeah, anyway.
Well, this has been magnificent. I've enjoyed it very, very much. There's an interesting problem where there's no way to overcome the subject-object divide unless there are objects, right? So there's automatically a certain problem we encounter. Because if there are no objects, there would be no possibility. If there was no difference, there'd be no possibility of relation, right? Like if everything was the same, there would be nothing to relate. So there's something kind of funny there, because also at the same time, it seems like the reason you relate is to be the same, right? Maybe not. Maybe it's not about being the same. Maybe it's about something about participating in that relation itself that is worth examining. There's a question here of what exactly it is that the artist is creating, right? Because that's what's kind of going on. And what if there's something about the artist is kind of front and center at this very problem of having to create an object to create a relation that we overcome the object to emphasize? Because likewise, if Beethoven, for example, is actually not so much trying to create Ode to Joy as he is the experience of listening to Ode to Joy, there's no possibility of creating the experience of listening to Ode to Joy without creating Ode to Joy. But the moment Ode to Joy is created, people can ask, what does it mean? Why did he write it? What's the point? So if the primary intention of Beethoven is the creation of the music of Ode to Joy, well, then that violence that is being described is basically inevitable because there's nothing he can do. And if Beethoven's main objective is to make sure that the audience receives Ode to Joy according to the correct meaning that he intended, then he is basically doomed to be suffering this violence and to be miserable, I suppose. But what if the product of Ode to Joy, and therefore the object according to which the violence of interpretation can occur, is secondary to his intention? And in fact, it's just simply a tragedy, in a way, a trade-off of competing goods, a necessary dilemma that the object has to be created for the experience. And that is that experience itself that is primary for the creative act, which would, of course, would be the collapse of the subject-object divide, because when you're really listening to Beethoven's Ninth, you're not listening to Beethoven's Ninth, you're in a sense are Beethoven's Ninth. There's a total relation, as Mr. Ebert is describing. I think this is especially easy to get if you imagine going back in time, not having MP3s, very rarely listening to music, etc., etc. And your uncle or somebody says, hey, there's this guy, Ludwig, I don't know who he is. He's coming into town, I have a little bit of money, maybe we can go and hear this thing. And you're like, what? Oh, okay, and you go. And you're at the world premiere of Beethoven's Ninth. And you will never again hear it. And you will tell people about it and they'll laugh and they'll be like, what are you talking about? And for you, because of the lack of the ability to re-listen to Beethoven's Ninth is much more profoundly an experience. I'm not saying that it isn't also an object, but it's easier to get in that circumstance why there is something so profoundly experiential in a very deep way to listening potentially to something like Beethoven's Ninth. Now imagine this. If you had that experience, would you approach politics differently? Today, it seems like politics has a lot to do with economics, money, commodification, and that the name of the game is to make money. Now, I am not saying that fighting poverty and stuff like that should not be a concern of politics, right? But what if there was an expanded horizon where a point of politics is to create conditions in which you can undergo the experience of listening to Beethoven's Ninth for the first time and never experience it again? That would be a different political mission. And that political mission, if you were to increase the probability of having those experiences, may transform the way that the political system unfolds and how the society may unfold. Because people who have undergone an experience like that carry themselves in the world differently. You mentioned psychedelics. There seems to be people who have psychedelic experiences very often carry themselves differently in the world, right? So that's an interesting line to explore on the differences between those, though that may open the box. But I think that was very nice to bring up, Jacob. So if politics, perhaps, were to consist of people who had those experiences, then that may change how people think about what politics should exist to do. In addition to economic concerns, the reason you would care perhaps about those economic concerns is to create the ground on which people can listen to Beethoven's Ninth per se. You would care about these economic concerns precisely so that people could have opportunities of these total relations of which would make them care to have that very ground and to vote in a manner to bring about that very ground. It's hard to enjoy Beethoven's Ninth if you're in poverty and can't eat, so that has to be a concern. But notice those concerns in politics is not primarily just for the economics, but in order to make possible an engagement with a certain mode of life that will then change the way that you live your life. That seems to be a different horizon of political consideration. And if indeed maybe the name of the game for the artist is primarily the experience, I can say for myself, the main thing Michelle and I will often do is short stories and different things like that. People asking questions on the meaning, it almost felt like something other. Yeah, I have reasons why I did that character that way and that story that way, but it was almost like that's not what I primarily created. That was just a necessary second consideration that came from the initial experience of the audience being lost in what the story built up to and what it pointed to. And all of the interpretations afterwards was almost something other. Lots of fun, had a great time talking about it, but it was other. And the fact that people may have kind of interpreted things I did not intend and maybe didn't even like, that was the necessary quote unquote violence I had to be willing to suffer so that the experience could come into existence. If I was not willing to suffer that possible violence, there could have been no experience. And so that's just part of the name of the game. So for me, to the question of how can the artist avoid this burden, I like to imagine maybe perhaps when Beethoven did Beethoven's Ninth, and they famously turned him around because he was deaf, because he didn't know, he couldn't hear anything. And he saw that everyone was taken up in the wonder of what they experienced. I like to think that maybe he went, that is what I created. And that will never burden me. And I think that's the business of the artist. Enjoyed this. Javier, please, if you have any closing thoughts.
It was just a comment on, you know, kind of reversing how we look at art. You know, the suffering of the artist is always kind of like what propels the work to manifest, you know? It's like suffering is such an excess that it literally drives you to create something. And Susan Sontag says that the artist is the exemplary sufferer. Now, if I were to say that there's any point without making it a sort of utility, without, you know, reducing it as such, it would be for the person to encounter that art in their own way as an exemplary sufferer, right? Rather than trying to derive some post hoc reasoning for why the art is there. The artist did that because he suffered in some type of way. There is something that he found problematic about reality. Now he can have intentions, and that's fine, but that is part of the suffering itself. And I think if we look at the suffering first and then the intentions, we can see, like, you know, we can have a better understanding without burdening the artist. You know, the artist, I love the artist because the artist is always such an ironic being. You know, you meet an artist and you're like, well, that's weird. That art doesn't seem that's like you. You know? So I feel like irony is something that needs to be more politicized instead of this AA kind of logic from that. You know, you're just trying to connect this AA, artist, art, artist, artwork. No, it's AB. It's so AB, it's ridiculous. But yeah, that's my comments.
No, thank you. And Mr. Ebert, please. And no, I think irony would be another framing. Like if art teaches irony, that would be a framing that one brings into politics and consider it. Mr. Ebert, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much, everyone.